shattered by life, how do we reassemble ourselves? I'm Mindy Corporon, and on April 13th, 2014, my life was shattered when a domestic terrorist murdered my father and 14-year-old son, as well as another woman. This white supremacist had come to a Jewish community center in Overland Park, Kansas, planned this ambush with the intent to murder Jews. My Christian father and son were not his intended victims. They were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Their deaths shattered my soul. Perhaps you too are a shattered soul. My new book, Healing a Shattered Soul, was written for those of you who are grieving a loss or have suffered a trauma. It's for those of you who are seeking inspiration, and for those who are searching for a glimmer of hope and faith, and for those in need of support during a difficult time. I'm sharing my story because I am a shattered soul, and I am now in the process of healing that shattered soul. My objective in life right now is to help other people heal, to make something good come from my dad and Reet's deaths. I am doing this because I believe God has asked me to do it. Grief and trauma are invisible. When we are experiencing grief and trauma, you cannot see it. You can't see anywhere on me that I have suffered greatly and that I still have grief, and that I have instances of anger, and sometimes I get very short-tempered. You cannot see that on me. You cannot see it on me like you can see a broken arm or a broken leg, or if I had a bandage on me. But just because you cannot see it does not mean that it is not there. Outlined in my chapters of my book are the story of how a shattered soul ached to find the glue it needed to piece myself and my family back together. As you read my book, you will find my journey heartbreaking, authentic, thought-provoking, and most of all, I hope you find it inspirational. My faith in God and humanity concretely paved my path to healing. My work with interfaith groups of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and all other faiths has restored my belief in the goodness of humankind. I got a lot of help along the way as I've been grieving. People have held my hand as I have walked this journey, and that's what I want to do for you. Together we can shine a light on peace. Together we are better. I'm Mindy Corporon, and I'd love for you to join me on this journey, healing a shattered soul.
Mindy, thank you for that good introduction to help folks who are visiting here today in our conversation understand where you're coming from. My name is Bill Tammeus. I'm a journalist in Kansas City, and I too have been struck by sudden loss of someone, actually my nephew, who died on 9/11 as a passenger on the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. Mindy and I are going to talk today about grief and how to deal with grief. And one way to introduce my situation will be to read a brief passage to you from my new book called Love, Loss, a 9/11 story of resilience and hope in an age of anxiety. And then I'd like Mindy to read a little bit from her book that tells the story of what happened on that day in 2014 to her family. In the prelude to my book, I write, an hour or so after receiving the first word of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, which killed nearly 3,000 people, editors at the Kansas City Star decided to put out an extra edition of the newspaper. It was the first time such an extra had been published since I arrived as a reporter at the newspaper in September of 1970. My assignment as an editorial page columnist then, which I became in early 1977, was to write the lead commentary piece for this special edition. I had about an hour and a half to craft 800 or 850 words that might help readers make sense of a bewildering event that left many Americans unmoored, terrified, confused, vulnerable, indignant, furious, wounded, or dead. I began by checking my own range of emotions that morning as the morning unfurled. Then I rashly universalized my reactions by attributing them in print to a collective we. It was not what's called the editorial we, which is a distance-making, self-referential way of indirectly referring to the writer of the word we. Rather, I used we as a team-gathering collective, a we're all in this together we. Yes, I was speaking for others or trying to, but not as an unaffected outsider, not as an indifferent observer. Precisely because I too am an American citizen, I was among those whose nation and person had been assaulted, though as I began to write that column, I had no idea how soon that truth would become agonizingly clear and intensely personal to me and my extended family. I received a phone call while I was working that day from my wife, who said, "Your sister has just sent an email that you need to read." So by the time I finally got my email system open, I found a note from my sister, Barbara Fife, with this subject line, "Very bad news." It simply said that from what she and her husband Jim could tell from their home in North Carolina, their son, my nephew, Carlton Douglas Fife, who lived in the Boston suburb of Brookline with his pregnant wife and toddler son, was a passenger on the first plane, American Flight 11, to crash into the World Trade Center. This disastrous possibility had not yet been confirmed, but everything pointed to it being true, as it turned out to be. So that's a little background of my lost story and perhaps why Mindy asked me to join this conversation today. Mindy, would you share a little more about what happened on that day in 2014?
Yes, thank you, Bill. And thank you for reading that. Each time you read that, I feel like I'm sitting at the Kansas City Star with you, receiving the information and sitting down to write. So thank you for reading that. So from my Healing a Shattered Soul book in the beginning, we decided to put in a news release to give context to the material. And that's what I'm going to read is the news release that was created. 3 killed in shootings at Kansas City area Jewish centers. Overland Park, Kansas, April 13th, 2014. 3 people were killed by a shooter outside the Jewish Community Center of Greater Kansas City and the Village Shalom Jewish Retirement Community on Sunday afternoon. The attacks shocked this peaceful community that is a suburb just over the state line from Kansas City, Missouri. The horrific news quickly reverberated nationwide one day before the Jewish festival of Passover begins. The shooter began firing a handgun and shotgun in a parking lot of the community center at about 1 p.m. 2 men who were targeted initially by the shooter escaped unhurt. Then the gunman fired into a truck that was approaching a parking place, killing 69-year-old William Lewis Corporon, MD, and his 14-year-old grandson, Reet Griffin Underwood. The 2 were arriving so Reet could take part in auditions for KC Superstar, a singing competition for teenagers that was going on inside the building. Dr. Corporon practiced medicine in Marlow and Duncan, Oklahoma from 1976 through 2003, when he and his wife moved to the Overland Park area to be closer to their grandchildren, according to a family statement. He continued to work 40 hours a week and loved spending free time with his grandchildren. Reet was a Life Scout and a freshman at Blue Valley High School who participated in debate, theater, and loved to sing. The center was filled that day with several programs, including a fitness program for children with autism. In another part of the building, a performance of To Kill a Mockingbird was about to begin, and auditions were underway for KC Superstar, an American Idol-style contest to find the best local teenage singer. The gunman fired randomly into the building from the parking lot, but did not injure anyone inside before he fled the scene. Center staff members were the first to call police and to provide medical assistance to the victims, but were unable to save their lives. The shooter next targeted the retirement center a mile away and killed Teresa Lamano, known as Terry, in that parking lot. He also shot at other people but missed and then fled the scene. He was arrested later in the afternoon by police, making anti-Semitic remarks as he was led away. FBI agents working with local authorities confirmed his anti-Semitic motives. Terry Lamano, 53, was an occupational therapist at the Children's Center for the Visually Impaired in Kansas City and was visiting her mother at Village Shalom as she did each Sunday afternoon.
Wow. I remember that day so well, partly because an Episcopal priest friend and a rabbi friend were putting together a vigil that night, a prayer vigil that I helped them to organize and actually spoke at briefly. And we were all shocked when you showed up to speak that same night to this group of people, which included some students with whom Reed had been in school. And it was an astonishing evening. So.
Yes, it was. I don't know that I ever knew that you were there, now that you just said that.
Yeah. Well, Mindy, as is now clear to people who are joining us today, both of us have lost someone to sudden, unexpected, unforeseen catastrophe. And I guess my first question for you is, in suffering that kind of pain and grief with the murder of your son and father, what does grief physically feel like to you?
Well, it's interesting. It's manifesting in me now, and I'm getting teary. So, what does it physically feel like? When it starts, I would best describe it as anxiety. For someone who doesn't know, it's anxious. It makes me anxious, and it does make my heart hurt. It physically feels like someone is holding onto my heart and squeezing it very tightly. You can feel it beating more heavily, and it's painful. It is a very uncomfortable pressure, and it gets to be so much that it produces tears, and that it pushes the tears out. That's what it feels like.
I wonder if you also experience what I sometimes do, which is, it's hard to explain. It's this sense almost of hollowness in my spirit, an emptiness, it's not that I can't still breathe. I can still breathe, but it's like my soul can't breathe, at least briefly. Does that make sense? Yes.
And there's a artwork. There's a piece of art that Isildine Abule showed me last week. And it's a piece of art created by a grieving parent. And I think the name of the art is called A Grieving Parent. And it's a sculpture. I was trying to find the word. It's a sculpture of a person, and their outline is there, but they're empty in the middle. Their whole middle. You can tell it's a human, and they're kind of leaning, but their whole middle is empty. And I do feel like that sometimes. I can feel like that. It feels painful. It hurts. It sometimes people say, I didn't understand when someone used to say, oh, my heart is aching for you. But it is an ache. It's a longing for something that's missing. That's what it feels like.
It's that very sentiment struck me, of all places, when I visited the Majdanek extermination camp in Poland a few years ago. The sense of what absence means. Absence means there is no wedding for this person. There is no bar mitzvah. There is no family gathering. There are no birthday parties. It is an absence of life. And I guess that's what I think of when I cross Carlton's birthday or his wedding anniversary, or I hear news about his sons. That absence is quite physical in its feeling.
It is physical, and it can be debilitating. And I talk about that in the book a lot, that so many people didn't understand how debilitated I was on so many different occasions, but it can be physically debilitating. It can stop you in your tracks and cause you to cry. It can keep you in bed. It can cause you to have foggy brain. It can cause you to be angry and lash out at people that you don't want to hurt, people that you love and care about. It can cause a lot more trauma than if you allow it to. And so it's real. The grief is very real. And it's a palatable feeling that I want people to try to understand more clearly.
Yeah, and professionals who deal with people in grief say all of what you just described is perfectly normal for someone who has been through what you've been through. And so you have to tell yourself sometimes, I'm not going crazy, I'm not out of the ordinary. This is what this is about. You've also explained in your new book, which is a marvelous read, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, that grief is a process, and you don't just get over it in a day and move on, but there are certain triggers that can bring it on, and we've talked a little about that. But there's one place in your book when you received a manila envelope that arrived in the mail, and it just tore you up. And I wonder if you would describe a little about what was in that envelope and why it was so traumatic for you.
The manila envelope was Reet's death certificate. And I didn't know when Reet's death certificate was going to arrive. I had called the funeral home to ask when the ashes would arrive, so I would be somewhat prepared for that. We had my dad and Reet cremated. But I was pulling the document out of the envelope before I realized what it was, and it was his death certificate. And it's just so black and white that you can't do anything else with it. And I know people might say, well, you know that you had a funeral, you know that you heard that he was deceased, you know that he was cremated, but yet the death certificate was just one more nail in the coffin. It was just one more really huge, painful, momentous occasion. And then I sat down to read it, and it was horrifying. It was horrifying to see that in plain black and white, he would not have a high school graduation. He would not get his full driver's license. He never filled a car with gas. He did get to drive on the highway with my dad. So my dad drove him back.
We won't tell anybody that.
They drove back from Oklahoma, and at some point in time, my dad let him drive. He had a permit to drive with adults, so he was legal. But he did. It makes me smile and be happy that he did get that. But I was reading the death certificate, and it wasn't for anyone really but me to say it's all true, and you just so badly want it to not be true that I was grasping at straws. And so in terms of when you said professionals say that everything I've gone through is normal, and that what I was going through, to not feel, crazy or unsettled about it, the craziness part, the unsettling part, is that you want them to walk through the door, and you really expect them to do so. You just think this cannot be real, and they're going to walk through the door. And I kept telling myself that he was just away at camp, but then knowing that he wasn't, or thinking, he was on a scout trip, but he wasn't. And at 6 months, it soaked in. They're not coming back. Like, they're really not coming back. And you have to start walking forward because they're not coming back.
Yeah, I took my sister Barbara longer than her husband Jim to get to the point where she recognized Carlton wasn't coming back at all. And she kept saying, no, this is all a dream, but not so. And the thing about getting a death certificate, I occasionally teach a class that I call Writing Your Spiritual Will. in which I have people prepare a document that they want to pass on, not their valuables, but their values to their children or grandchildren. And the first thing I do when I teach that class is to have them fill out at least part of their own death certificate, so that it becomes absolutely clear that death, unlike what a lot of Americans seem to think, death is not an alternative. It's real.
Mhm.
It's not an option. And that death certificate exercise really seems to focus them on where we need to go with this. I think the things that struck my sister Barbara the way that you were struck with a death certificate was when she finally received the 1 7-inch thigh bone piece of Carlton in the mail delivered to her house. And just then it finally, oh my goodness, this is real.
Right. And for me, it was the death certificate at that moment, but it came early. It came early to me. I mean, I received it in May, but I still had ideas that they might walk through the door, that they might come through the back door. I kept looking out the back door thinking, this is all a nightmare. We're all living in a nightmare, and I'm going to wake up and it's just going to be this bad nightmare. Yeah, well, the piece of Carlton that finally arrived, it was a long time. I mean, so a couple of years at least. Right.
Mindy, when you are feeling sad, when this sense of grief comes over you again, what do you do to make that go away, or do you just sit with it for a while?
I have learned that it depends on where I am. It really does depend on where I am. If I am, in a live interview with someone, I'm probably not going to allow myself just to break down completely. So I've bottled it just enough to continue to have the conversation with you. But if I'm allowing myself to, I will sit in it for a while. I think it's healthiest. I've learned for me, it is healthiest to allow it to kind of simmer and allow the tears to come. Because then that aching feeling that is simmering, and then it boils over and the tears come, when I allow that to happen, I can then breathe. I can breathe deeply. And I always hear in the darkest moments, I always hear, I am with you. And I just feel like, okay, I can take another breath. I can take another step. I can move on. I mean, I have had some really just horrendous mornings where I might have a big meeting later that day and I might be anxious, and then I'll have a whole crying episode for an hour and I am a mess. My eyes are puffy. I look a mess. Maybe I already showered. Maybe I already put makeup on, and now I'm a disaster. And I'm just like, okay, I have to start all over again. But it is a cathartic process to allow yourself to let the emotions out. And I think that that is significantly part of my healing process, is to allow those tears to flow as quickly and as often as possible, so that I'm not stuffing them back down inside of me and continuing that ache and letting that fester.
My guess is that counselors, pastors maybe have told you in this process, don't just crush that grief. Don't hide it. If you bury it, it will come back to you later in a way that will be destructive and unhealthy. And I presume you've heard that from more than one person.
I have heard that, but I heard it from a counselor for Lucas. So our son Lucas was 12 at the time, and he cried early on, and then I noticed that he stopped crying. And he didn't want to talk about Reet. He didn't want me to say Reet's name, which was very painful for me. I wanted to heal. I wanted to heal a certain way, and Lucas needed to heal a different way. And there was a lot of back and forth on how we were each going to heal. And I learned from his counseling sessions that he needed to get those feelings out. And if it wasn't going to be tears, it needed to be something. And so he took up a hammer one time and tore down the treehouse in the backyard, tore it all down one day. And then he tried rebuilding it, which was fine. We all went out and tried rebuilding it. And then he took up planting plants one time and dug a bunch of holes in the backyard. And then he started hitting a little white golf ball. And that really helped him. He will cry, and he will allow himself to cry, which I think is very mature of him, to be able to know that when he feels whatever that feeling is for him, he knows it's time to just unbottle it and allow the tears to come, because he knows that the other side of that, he'll feel better.
Yeah. I want to ask you something about Lucas. You write that your husband's cousin, I think Kim, reached out to Lucas right after the murders and asked what she and her family could do for him. And it was really an interesting and extraordinary act. And people often wonder after a death, what can I do for this family? And what were some of the things that people did for Lucas that were especially helpful, and for you and for Len, your husband?
Yes. So immediately what was helpful, and this is going to sound so strange maybe, was paper products. So I know that seems odd, but when you have something happen to your family and people start coming into your house, you don't realize that you're going to run out of toilet paper very quickly. And so 2 people brought boxes full of paper products. They brought napkins, plates, they brought plastic, like Tupperware. They brought toilet paper, paper towels, because that's something that when you're hurting and reeling, and you're welcoming people into your house because you can't even think different to not do that, they might need something. They might need to use a paper towel, and you might be out. And so people brought paper products, and I offer that to other people as a suggestion. And I have done that myself. When someone had a very significant tragedy, I took paper products, and I took water. I took bottles of water, just extra supplies for people coming to their house. I don't know exactly. I'd have to ask Lynn and Lucas when they were able to eat. I didn't eat for 4 days. So I had like a Snicker bar and a Coke, and then maybe another Snicker bar and a Coke. And so then someone, KK, sat down and fed me. She called me, and she called the house and said, I'm on my way for my turn to watch the house and be there with the family. What will Mindy eat today? And I sat there and thought, I felt like a child. And I said, I'll eat shrimp. And so she went to get shrimp at Dean and DeLuca, was still open. And then she got to the house and she sat down and she would poke them into my mouth, because everyone faces stress differently. And when I get really stressed, I just don't eat. I just have no appetite and I don't eat. So if someone were to be an eater, I think the important thing is to have healthy choices around, to have healthy options. So whatever that might look like for someone. Another family did take Lucas to go get him a new suit for the funeral. So, he was 12, and I think he might have had a sport coat before, maybe when he was 10, but it sure didn't fit him when he was 12. So he needed clothes, and our dog needed to be walked. It's just simple things like that. How to run a household. And our friends came in and really breathed life into our home.
Well, I don't put Coca-Cola in this category, but Snickers are one of God's gifts to us. I want you to know.
Snickers has been a gift I have given to other people when they have had a trauma. When I heard about someone who lost a son, I was on my way somewhere else, and I veered, and I went by like a quick trip, and I picked up a 6-pack of Coke, a 6-pack of water, and a whole box of Snicker bars, because you just don't know who might need those at any given time.
You mentioned that Lucas found golf. How did that help to heal him, and what did it do to bring your family together?
It got us all outside the house. So we were living in the house together in different rooms. I mean, like I would be in either Reed's room, which I made into the office, or I'd be at the computer at the kitchen table. Lynn was outside a lot. Lynn had started his healing process outside. And then Lucas was mostly inside, but then found outside. So how did it start? It was the second time he was released from Research Medical Center. So he needed to go to Research Medical Center twice, first in 2014, and then in 2015. And when he was released the second time, he said, "Can I go to the golf course?" And when you are so worried about your child, and they come to you and want something really that innocuous, we just said yes. So I think Lynn drove him there in about 30 seconds. So and Lucas didn't have clubs. We didn't own clubs. Lynn and I are not golfers. Lucas had been at a golf camp 2 summers prior with Reed before Reed died. They'd been in like a 4-day golf clinic, when you're looking for something for your kids to do. Yeah. And so he went to the golf course, and he told Lynn initially, "I feel close to Reed. I feel close to Popeye," which is what we call my dad, "when I'm outside." And he loved nature, and he enjoyed golf. He started enjoying golf, and so we got him in lessons very quickly.
Good. Interesting. I'm a bad golfer, but I do try to play on Friday mornings, and it's lovely to just, you can leave a lot behind at that point.
There's so much to be said about nature. I mean, he happened to be playing golf, but a lot of it was about being out in nature. And Lynn found that. Lynn found a significant healing being outside. And he would tell me that. He'd say, "I can't stay in the house. I have to go outside." And so he spent a lot of time in the yard. He was our landscaper, and he loved doing that.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about that I want to ask you in a couple of minutes, but I want to go somewhere else first. Your brother Will explained that he is now more patient as a father, spouse, and friend than he perceived himself to be before the shooting. How are you different today? What has changed for you?
How am I different? So I know they're not asking me what am I doing that's different, because everything I'm doing is different than I was doing then. So you're asking me, how am I different? I am more flexible about things. I am more aware of what the big picture looks like. For instance, I could die this afternoon in a car wreck. I mean, I could get really bad news that someone else that I know and love had a stroke and died. That doesn't mean I want it to happen or I think about it and I don't dwell on it. But when little things happen, like someone cuts me off in traffic, it doesn't bother me. If I can't get the right item at the grocery store, I'm like, it's not meant to be. So little things don't bother me. Also, in all the planning that I do, Faith Always Wins in 7 days, I'm like, it's either going to work or it's not. And I'm just a lot more relaxed about pretty much everything. Lucas took a huge different path than other students, and we were willing for him to take as much of a different path as needed. And that was one big eye-opener for me between the decisions we were making as parents for Lucas and the decisions that we would have made if Reed had been alive. I was willing for him to do whatever he needed to do at that time to stay alive. When your choices are, okay, your child being alive or your child going to college, I'm like, I'll just take alive, thank you. And so you just think differently about life. And so those are some things I'm different that make me different. I do still get impatient about things, but I would say I'm probably more patient and I'm definitely more thoughtful to other people about their story and asking people about their story, because I share my story often when people engage me in conversation. As soon as they say, "And do you have any children?" then the story comes up. And so I'm quick to keep the conversation going with them so that they don't feel like they just stepped in a big pile of dew. You know, they're like, oh my gosh, which can be very uncomfortable. So I just have practiced that, and I am patient with people if they feel like they've hurt my feelings. I'm patient to explain to them, you know, where I am in my healing process.
You grew up a person of faith. You've been active in a church for a long time. I'm just curious, how do you perceive your theology has changed, if at all, because of what you went through? And particularly, as I once asked you for a column I wrote, your notion about where evil comes from.
Yeah, so I didn't used to believe in evil. I didn't really think about evil. But evil is real. Evil's real. So my theology has changed significantly. I grew up thinking that Jesus was the only way. I grew up thinking that I was a Christian and I needed to believe in Jesus to go to heaven. And when this happened, it wasn't at all so much about Dad and Reed being Christian or not being Christian, because they both were Christian, and that, you know, I'm like, okay, they're going to heaven. I just have this great belief in that. What happened, Bill, was that so many people that were Jewish, of the Jewish faith, embraced us. I mean, they just enveloped us. And the shooter thought he was murdering Jews. And I just did this exploration in Judaism. And the first several months I was thinking, well, what do Jewish people think when they die? What do they think is going to happen? And so I explored that in my own, you know, process. And I talk about that in the book. And then Islam entered into my life in December of 2014. And I started taking a look at other faiths. And here's what I would like to say about my theology. And I've heard someone else explain it this way too. So I'm kind of copying, but I don't know who I'm copying from. But I had the same idea, is that when I get to heaven, there are going to be a lot of other people there that look like me and that don't look like me. And I may not have seen many of those people or all of those people on the path to get to heaven. But we all got there somehow. We all took our own journey. Our own spirit got us to our place of sanctuary, our place of Holy Spirit. Now, for me, that is the Holy Spirit. That's what I'm going to be following. And they're going to be following what they're following. But I feel like that is where we all get up there. And it's in this blessed place that is called heaven to me. That's what I call it.
And I try to remind myself that it's not my job to say who's going and who isn't, and that's God's job, and God can do that a lot better than I can.
Right.
Turns out.
I agree.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Faith Always Wins in 7 days. You describe your story as a, quote, journey of contagious kindness, and that's certainly been true of you since all of this happened. And so it's my way of asking you to describe why you started the Faith Always Wins Foundation and the Give 7 Days events that we've just gone through again this year. What was the purpose, and how do you think that is making Kansas City a better place?
Thank you. The Faith Always Wins Foundation was initially created to hold assets that were coming in, to hold just some funds that were coming in. So sometimes people might do a GoFundMe or something when there's a tragedy. People from all over want to help. And so it was similar to that. There were checks being sent to the Church of the Resurrection or to Scouting or to Operation Breakthrough. And then there were just checks being sent to the funeral home in our name. And we wanted to put those in a safe place. So literally the foundation was originally created to be a safe environment for money that was coming in, that people were trusting us with. People that I didn't know were sending money because they were sorrowful for us and they wanted to give us something to help. They might have thought we were going to buy dinner with it. I'm not sure. So we put that money into the foundation. And then over the years, and in the first year, maybe 18 months, with my mother and my younger brother, Tony, and our initial board of directors, we talked about how we want to raise enough money that we can give back, in the area of medical initiatives, because my dad was a physician, and in the area of performing arts. So we do have, the board has an underlying idea to give back into those two areas in particular that are meaningful to the two people in our lives that were taken. The mission morphed as well. The mission became to promote dialogue for the betterment of our world through kindness, faith, and healing. And that is what the Faith Always Wins Foundation has continued to do, and has been very steady at that. I would say the last 3 to 4 years of the 7 has been very steady in that path. In the kindness, lane, in the kindness pillar, we created 7 days. And Bill, what's interesting is they were both being created at the same time. And 7 days was actually launched as quickly as Faith Always Wins was created. So 7 days got great branding, and 7 days is an opportunity. It's a challenge for people to be kind for 7 days in a row, or to be kind, to someone that you hadn't ever known before. And we have the themes. We have love, discover, others, connect, you, go, onward. And each theme has its own resonating meaning. And all of this together is to help people heal. It's to help anyone who touches it feel better about themselves and feel better about humanity, and get an idea of how to pay it forward and be a ripple of kindness.
Yeah. The thing I've particularly appreciated about all of this is that although it is rooted in your Christian faith, it is an interfaith effort. You've brought in people from a variety of religious traditions, and you've discovered what you have in common, and also empowered people to say, I appreciate what I've learned from your faith, but that's not who I am, and you need to know who I am, and to be honest about their own commitments. So yeah.
One of the most fascinating things that I learned along the way, I went to prayers at the Islamic Center of Johnson County one time with Bilal Jamal. So Bilal is one of Reet's friends, and I asked him if I could go to prayers at the ICJC. And I had no idea what I was getting into, and I frequently don't. I just said, "Oh, Bilal, I'll meet you there." And he was like, "Okay." Well, his mom and sister met me at the door, and then I went in with his mom and his sister, and I think a friend. So I went in with the women, and I was kind of like, where's Bilal going? I mean, it was all new to me, Bill, but I was trying. And so we went in for prayer, and we watched the prayer service, the imam give the message. And it was so fascinating. And I said to them later, and to other people, friends of mine that are Christian and Jewish, the message that the imam gave was not unlike any message that any other pastor would have given, like a Christian pastor, because I haven't heard that many Jewish sermons, so I can speak to what Christian pastors would talk about. They talked about service to community, and the imam talked about charity. And the imam said, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything at all. And I was like, oh my gosh, I heard all of this, growing up. And then at the end, a woman plopped herself down in front of me, and she said, do you have any questions? And I said, yes. Do you believe in Jesus? And she said, yes, we believe in Jesus. We believe he was a prophet. And that's what I've learned about Judaism and Islam, is that, yes, they believe in Jesus. Jesus is part of their story. It's just that he is not the Christ or the Savior. He's a prophet. But she said to me, Islam believes in Jesus. And so putting myself in those situations because of the murders has opened my heart and my mind. And I feel like I have a responsibility to share what I know with other people that look like me, other people that are white Christians. I want to share with them, how much more we can learn about one another if we take the time to do that.
Yeah. And because people who describe themselves as Muslims, although they had distorted that religion beyond belief, they were the ones who killed Carlton. I've felt a kind of special obligation to explain to readers how they've distorted traditional Islam. I went to the Middle East in '02 to spend time in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Uzbekistan and to write about Islam today. And so that's part of my obligation as well, to do that kind of education work and to also find those common ground areas that, like you say, a pastor getting up and preaching a sermon about, can't say anything good, shut up. What is more universal than that?
That's right. That's very universal right now.
Yeah, right. One other area that you've gotten into a little bit, growing out of all of this, is workplace healing. Would you tell us just a little about what you've done in that area and why that's important?
Yes. In 2015, I realized, unfortunately, that I needed to leave my place of work. I just did not have the compassion that someone should have to be in the role that I was in, and as a financial advisor. And I was a CEO and a financial advisor, but I was meeting with clients at the time. And so I pulled myself into the position more of CEO and only a CEO. I was that was my role, but I also used to meet with clients. And so after about 2015 and then into 16, I started morphing out of meeting with clients because I was afraid that I may blow up on one of them. I may get really angry at one of them if they mention that their child isn't getting into the college that they're going to get into, whereas I have a child that isn't even living.
Yeah.
And so I was very concerned about my abilities to continue doing what I was doing to the extent and to the level, the high quality level that Boyer Corporon that we had from our firm. So as I was walking through the steps to leave the firm, I started seeing like corporate America differently. And I noticed that my team did what they could do to talk to me, but they didn't have the tools to talk to me. And we stumbled a lot along the way. Like, what's Mindy thinking today? And should we talk to Mindy about her kids today? And, we stumbled a lot in that. And so then as I left, I realized maybe this is where some of my passion is that I can help other corporations onboard their people. And I call it reintegrating with a soft landing. So I reintegrated, like, I just landed hard, and it wasn't healthy for any of us. And I would love to be able to help. And that's what Workplace Healing is doing, is we are building a system that will measure grief in the workplace and will help employers understand what's going on more in depth in a heart-based sense in their workplace. Because when you pay attention to the heart and you acknowledge that people are hurting, you're going to get your return on your investment. It's going to come.
Yep.
But you're not going to get it if someone is not reintegrated and they just leave. And so when people experience trauma, they need to be acknowledged. If they are not acknowledged, the likelihood of them leaving is extremely high. And so Workplace Healing is working on those facets for corporations and managers to help give them the tools so that they can easily talk to that employee that's coming back and help reintegrate them in what we call a soft landing.
I don't know this. I haven't asked you this before, but I'm wondering whether you've had yet any opportunity to deal with companies who have experienced some company-wide trauma, like the recent shooting at a FedEx place in, I think, Indianapolis. But has that come your way yet?
It has not yet, but I use that, unfortunately, I wasn't using FedEx as an example yet, but that is unfortunately a good example. So what I have explained to people is that when Workplace Healing is up and running, that I see us as boots on the ground available to something like the Las Vegas shooting. So I use that as an example. So many people were affected. So many companies were affected by all the people that were either murdered or injured or just traumatized by the entire event. That when workplace healing is ready, I see us as boots on the ground for helping those employers reintegrate and get back up and running. And so the same could be said for what happened at FedEx. If I received a phone call from someone and they said, "Can you come and help us?" we would be able to do that. We are not putting ourselves out there for that right now. Right now, Workplace Healing is working on our technology because it is important that we have the right measuring tools to measure what's going on in a company when we first show up, and then what's going on in that company after they've used our services and our content.
Yeah. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes left here as I read things, and there are a couple of other questions I want to quickly throw your way, and then ask what else you would like to tell folks who are with us today. One is about the experience of writing the book. I know you told me once that you began writing your story and then realized this can't be just my story. I have to bring in other family members and others who are affected by this. Describe that process, and how is the book different because you changed tracks a little bit?
It was humbling. That's a humbling process. So I wrote the story all about me. I wrote the story about my childhood and all about me, and Mindy did this and Mindy did that, and it was all about me. And it fell very flat. It didn't have a great story arc. It didn't sit well with some of my family members. It didn't sit well with me after a while, after I kind of stood back and looked at it, and I thought, well, that was kind of crappy to do all that, because I just wrote it all about me. And I took 2 years off. I set it down for 2 full years, and I wasn't really angry or upset about the feedback that I'd gotten, but I had to process that. And again, it was pretty humbling. And I looked at the stories that I knew, Dan Stringfield, Mickey Blount. I looked at the stories of the other people, my brother Will, my brother Tony, and my mom. And I thought, my story gets told so often. I get interviewed so often. Their stories are not being told. And it's a ripple. It's a negative ripple in a trauma situation, and it needs to be addressed. So for instance, you brought up the FedEx shooting. There are thousands of people that will end up being affected. Thousands, from nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles and friends from high school who say, "Oh my gosh, my friend was murdered." People who know me from my whole walk of life will say, "I've never known anyone that's lost anyone like that. But if they know me, they now know someone who suffered a hate crime and had family members die violently." And so the story needed to be told about other people. So it was a humbling experience, but then it was very cathartic to interview them, like to interview Christine Hamley from Overland Park Regional. And it was very healing. The whole process was healing for me.
Wow. You mentioned Oklahoma earlier, where you grew up, and you mentioned Lucas's desire and love of being out in nature. I'm currently reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's about indigenous wisdom, and she says that the author, Robin Wall Kimmerer, at one point says, "To become indigenous is to grow in the circle of healing to include all of creation," meaning nature. And I'm wondering, from your own experience in growing up in Oklahoma, which, as you know, and historically was named Indian Territory, where a lot of indigenous people were sent off to there, did you have an opportunity to learn some indigenous wisdom, and has that kind of bubbled to the surface as you've been doing what you've been doing since the shooting?
So I don't know that what I've learned is specifically indigenous, because even some of the things that I learned from my grandmother, Muzzy, and my mom, I thought that they were their thoughts and they were psalms or proverbs. And so I'm not sure if what I learned was specific to Indigenous, but I will tell you, you know, I have this saying that I learned. It's not my saying, but I learned it. If you ride a horse, you don't put them away wet. You take care of them and you dry them off and you put them back, you know, the way you got them. And so, but that was about a horse. I learned that when I learned about tack and how to ride a horse and how to care for a horse is you brush it, you know, you walk it, you don't just run them and then throw them back into the barn. And so when you started talking about Oklahoma and Indigenous and learning, those are things that I learned. I learned a lot about nature, but I don't know that I ever took it to mean Indigenous until you just brought it up. And then when you were talking, I was thinking, for me, nature now is the ocean. So I love prairie grass. I love mountains. I love nature. But I tell you what, I am healing at the beach. I am healing with the ocean, and that has been very therapeutic for me to be back with nature in that way.
Is part of that to sense the rhythm of the ocean, the tides back and forth, the waves? What is it?
It's more about the enormity of the ocean. Mm-hmm. It is more about how small I am and how much control I don't have. Mm-hmm. It's really, when I look at the ocean and either the sunrise or the moonrise, I am so small in this world. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. I'm okay being who I am. And I'm okay with that big, vast ocean having a whole lot more going on than I do.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Mindy, you have 2 more conversations coming up about this. Do you want to say a word about with whom and when?
I do. Thank you, Bill. And it has just been a pleasure to be in conversation with you. You're always so comfortable and you always ask great questions and are so thoughtful. Yes. So on the 29th of April, Alana Mueller and I will be in conversation, and it'll be at the same start time. It'll be at 3:00 Central. And then May 3rd is the book's birthday. And I am going to be in conversation with Pastor Adam Hamilton, who wrote the foreword to Healing a Shattered Soul. So you and Alana and Pastor Adam Hamilton are like my lineup for my book launch, so that people can, you know, hear from people that are meaningful to me and engage. So I appreciate you very much.
Thank you. Adam, by the way, wrote wrote the foreword for my book as well, and you wrote the afterword. So
I got to write the afterword. Yes. Now I have to say, I just want to say this. I was so flattered because you asked me to write like a preface or a foreword. And so I wrote it. And then I remember the email you sent me and you said, Adam Hamilton wrote a foreword. We're moving you to the afterward. Are you okay with that? And there I am. I'm like, I am this big. It is okay. It is not a problem. I offer to the world, you know, around me what I feel like I have at the time. And I love the people that I do have around me that pour back into me, and I accept that. I like to be around people who pour back in really good love and energy. I think that's very important to have those kind of people around us. And I've been blessed to have you around me doing that same thing.
Thank you. For those of you who are listening, there is a comments section on the page today. And if you go to that, you will find links, Amazon links to both Mindy's new book and my new book. And we encourage you actually, I encourage you to use a local independent publisher. But if you buy from Amazon, that's fine too. So I just wanted to point out that those links are there. Mindy, thank you for asking me, and I will allow you to close.
Yes, you're welcome. I would like to say that, yes, local to Kansas City. So Rainy Day Books has the books, and also people can obviously get them through the Kansas City Public Library, right? You hosted at the Kansas City Public Library. Right. So I know people can do that as well. So thank you so much. I appreciate people joining us. And then hopefully I'll see people again. Anybody who wants to join us on April 29th.
Great.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Mindy. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you too.